Okay, maybe a few still. Al?
Oh, sorry.
Kind of remind us again of just a few things that we talked about yesterday. When I first got up here yesterday, we talked about what the research gave us kind of 5 critical learnings, if you remember me talking about that. So one of those did encompass the personas. Second again was the scale of belief, those 6 markers on the scale of belief. And then a third piece that we talked about yesterday is the green dot that's on every one of these personas, indicating that every person is actually willing to have a spiritual conversation or a conversation about spirituality if they're approached in a certain way. I want to go back to the personas for just a minute, because I think there's still some confusion maybe a little bit about the personas versus the scale of belief. Again, as you look at these personas, what they're really offering, if you look at all the data, even if you're just looking at your small card, your what we call them playing cards, that are the same information that's on these pop-ups, they're profiles. And they're giving you a certain amount of data that gives you windows into who they are, but they're insufficient, right? But they're profiles of a person that exists. And these 7 people exist all around us. But you know what else they are? They're a framework to a story. This is where the data is insufficient. It gives us some starting points, but it's actually insufficient for us to move probably in any intentional way towards them in the conversation about faith. We need the story. It gives us a framework for a story, but we don't know the story. We don't know Jen's story. We just know some things about Jen. I'll give you one example of this. A while back, I largely office out of my home in my role with Crew, and so I have, a dozen remote offices that serve coffee all over Austin. One of those being La Madeline. And so I usually wait for the breakfast rush hour to end, and then I camp out, for a while in La Madeline. And there was a particular La Madeline that I used to frequent often. And one particular day, and actually it must have been several days in a row, and I just wasn't cognizant of it, but I was preparing for something. I was going to teach something biblically, and I had my Bible and 4 or 5 other books. Some of them were commentaries or other helps, and I was prepping, like some of you do. And so I had that spread out all over the table at La Madeline. And the assistant manager, finally, very intentionally, who I had seen before, didn't know her name, we'll call her Danielle because she was probably most like Danielle in the persona. She came walking up and says, "What are you doing with all these books? You must be the biggest reader I know. What are you reading about all the time?" And I was kind of taken aback because I had my head down. I looked up and first thought maybe I'm in trouble, like maybe I'm not spending enough money for all the space I'm taking up in La Madeline. And I said, well, I kind of stumble about it. Occasionally I get a chance to teach the Bible, and I'm doing some preparation for a future conference. And, I didn't know where that was going to go. Again, I was a little caught off guard. She goes, "Really?" Because that's interesting to me. I go, "Really? Do you read the Bible?" She goes, "No, I've never really read the Bible." And actually where the conversation went, not just in that season, I actually had a choice to make at that moment, right? Because when you're in preparation mode, do I really want to do this, or I've got a window, I've got to get this done. But the Holy Spirit kind of prompted to stop, slow down. And actually over several different occasions of seeing this assistant manager, I began to hear her story. Recently divorced, single mom, trying to figure out how her ends are going to meet, not sure if the La Madeline salary was going to be enough to make this all work, but had an interest in what I was doing, had a little bit of an interest in spirituality. Over time, I bought her a copy of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's book, gave it to her. And then one day I walked in and she was gone. And I asked one of the wait staff, we'll call her Danielle, "What happened to Danielle?" And she goes, "Oh, she got a promotion in the La Madeline chain to San Antonio." And I was kind of happy for her because I knew again some of her story and how she was trying to figure this out financially. But I was a little sad too because I still didn't know exactly where she stood with Jesus. We didn't get to continue that conversation. I talked to her a few more times as I'd come in and out of there. I share that for 2 reasons. One is that because I did need to know her story. Otherwise, I only have a framework. She ended up being pretty anxious about a lot of things. But there was an interest in faith. She was probably somewhere between Danielle and Runn. Here's the fascinating thing, too. I tell it for another reason, because one day I'm meeting with one of my friends who lives in San Antonio. I shared a little bit of the story. He said, "Wait a minute, what's her name?" So we'll call her Danielle. Danielle goes, "I know Danielle. I know the La Madeline she works at. She's not coming to our church." And again, I still didn't know if she'd come to faith. He wasn't sure either. But again, it showed me the sovereignty of God. And so we realized that these stories intersect, right? I needed to know more than the framework of the data about Danielle. I needed to hear her story. But God knew a bigger story that he was creating. I might have been one link in the chain. Again, I didn't want to break the chain. Hopefully it was a good link. But somebody else was going to be a link too. And I'm assuming today that she probably knows Jesus. Because it seemed like he was after her. And I was just one link in the chain. But again, this idea that personas create profiles are really a framework to a story. We need to enter in and find out more about that story. And then God's doing what he always does along the way. And then the scale of belief, again, we don't change the data. We're not trying to change the data. We're not necessarily trying to change the story they have up until now. Again, what we're putting our energy and effort and trusting God for is the scale of belief. How do we move from unaware to actually one day they might be a guide leading others on that faith journey? And so just again to see a little bit of the difference between what the personas provide and what the scale of belief looks like. Okay, but now we're going to talk about the fourth critical learning. We're going to talk about 3 core longings. Okay, so the 3 core longings, as we begin to get a little more practical on this, and this is what the research revealed again, that as we did this research, both the quantitative and the qualitative, there were 3 core longings that rose to the top that actually said we all have. And so Tom took us on a little bit of an exercise, kind of at a societal level, to say what are some of those headline pieces that actually have us thinking, that do impact us. And so we listed about 20 things up here that are real, and we're kind of confronted with every day. And we even laughed about some of them. Wow, they're 3 weeks old. It's changed in the last 3 weeks. And yet they do impact us. And so we want to look at these 3 core longings that we all possess, both followers of Christ and those who don't follow Christ, and they become authentic connection points and pathways to conversation. Okay, here are both those things. Authentic connection points. Why? Because we actually experience them too. We have the same longings as those who don't know Jesus. I think it's true because we are created in modern day. That we share those same core longings. But they also become pathways to conversation. If they're true longings, then they're a pathway to a conversation. They're both an authentic connection because we share it with them. That opens the door to a pathway of conversation. We can talk about our common core longing. Okay? So what are those 3 core longings? First one is peace. And let me define that for you. I'm going to give you very simple definitions because I think it's helpful if we think about this from the same construct. I'm going to say that the definition of peace is the absence of anxiety. The absence of anxiety. This could be at a personal level, or again, it could be at a societal level. Our peace can be disrupted either way. And you see some things up on the screen there, understanding each other, what we care about. These things on the right actually become ways in which we can help bring peace, demonstrate peace, reduce anxiety. When we show respect, when we treat people with dignity, when we treat people with humanity or kindness, or bring them into community, those actually become avenues toward peace. We know, ultimately, that if they're going to experience real peace, it's going to come from a relationship with Jesus. But these also become, I think, pathways to peace, expressions of peace that we can offer along the way. Again, we did the exercise, but you guys listed this well. You think at a societal level, even in just this past week, things that in a hyper-connected world actually do disrupt our peace. I do wonder again, because there were 2 more African-American males that were killed in the past 7 days, one in Minnesota, one in Maryland. And you wonder how many more? How is this going to keep going on? And it does impact us. It disrupts our peace. We do it. Justice Kennedy stepping down. What does that mean? There's times I feel like the Supreme Court has far more power than Congress or the presidency. And what does that mean for the future of our country? And there's a sense where there's a disruption, potentially, of that peace that I experience day in, day out. And the list goes on and on. We listed a number of things. And at a societal level, in a hyper-connected world, those things actually do affect us. They influence us. They disrupt our peace. The fascinating thing to me in a hyper-connected world is that we're almost completely unknown these days. So there's almost no outlet for that anxiety to be dealt with, and it feels like that's why we get into Twitter wars. It seems to be the only outlet for the expression of our anxiety. But there's also personal anxiety, right? there's just life in a broken world. One aspect that my wife and I have been walking through this past year, last August when Hurricane Harvey hit, my in-laws live in the city of Houston, and they lost 99% of everything they owned. They lived in this same house for 47 years, I believe. And the fascinating thing, too, is it actually wasn't because of the hurricane itself, but it's because the city of Houston decided to sacrifice 2 neighborhoods for the sake of 10. And so the reservoirs upstream, which actually also they found out had about 7 feet worth of sludge that the Corps of Engineers had never drained, made them overflow even more readily. And as those reservoirs overflowed and they released water, it came pouring into my in-laws' neighborhood. And they had 5 feet of water in their home and raw sewage. Lost their cars, lost their possessions. We did laugh at them a little bit along the way. While this was literally going on, I also have a brother-in-law that also serves with crew and lives in Orlando. And so we're kind of trading off about every other hour. You know, either my wife's calling or her brother's calling, hey, how are you guys doing? We know the water's kind of rising. And they would say, oh yeah, you know, it's down the street. We can kind of see it, but it's nowhere close to us. And then we call back in a couple hours. Yeah, it's, you know, it's in our neighbor's yard, but it's not a big deal. You know, we call back and like, yeah, it's at our front door. We're fine. We're just kind of laughing at them. And finally, you know, they said, well, what are you going to do about that? Oh, we made some peanut butter sandwiches. We're going to move upstairs. Like, oh, this isn't a solution. And we have laughed at our son, who's 20-something, you know, he's getting some of this data too. We say, you know, 20-year-olds think they're better than a hurricane, and 80-year-olds, that's the age of in-laws, it just doesn't matter anymore. Like, they don't care. But eventually we said, you know, oh, now there's a foot of water in our house. Okay, we've got to get you out of there. And eventually we found one of Carrie's brothers, old fraternity brothers from the University of Texas. He literally canoed them out, got them to a hotel, which then flooded immediately the next day, had to canoe them out again. And finally they came and stayed with Carrie and I for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And that began a journey that really didn't end until just about 8 to 10 weeks ago. Because it took that long to resettle them and find them a new place to live, as they're both 81, 82. It was a journey. And there were many anxious days. As a follower of Jesus, and as my wife is a follower of Jesus, we experienced anxiety in and out constantly. Because things kept changing, and things were on the move, and where was the money coming from? And you're dealing with FEMA, and you're dealing with the city of Houston, and you're dealing with insurance, and now we got to get a rental car. I mean, all this stuff, you know, it was just nonstop. Not to mention that 47 years of history had been completely erased. Anxiety, right? We experienced it too. And that had nothing to do with Justice Kennedy. That was personal. And that's just living life in a broken world. We share in that. That does become a point of authentic connection. And it does become a pathway to a conversation. Because a whole lot of people in the city of Houston went through that. And a whole lot, and everybody that we come in contact with today is experiencing probably some level of personal anxiety. I used to have a mentor that said, behind every face is a drama. And I think that's true. Sometimes I forget to look in their face and wonder about the drama that's behind it. But it's true. There's a level of personal disruption of that peace that they long for that's going on all the time. Sometimes it comes from societal issues, sometimes it's deeply personal. But it's a core longing. We were made for something different, weren't we? We were made for the garden, which will eventually end up in the city, as Jake talked about in Revelation. But right now, it's this grand redemptive piece of salvation history. It's in the wild field. It's pretty wild, pretty broken. So peace. And again, what I want you to see in these slides is they're concentric circles. And why that matters is because as entry points for the gospel, this is actually one of the easiest ones. You're going to see the other two move in closer. They get a little more core to who we are. And sometimes in our gospel presentations, we jump to the core. And sometimes people feel a little overwhelmed by that, maybe even a little bit violated by that. But this is actually probably the easiest entry point because it is so common and people so long for it so much. So you'll see that these circles begin to get more intimate as we move inward. The next one is prosperity. Now let me quickly say, what we don't mean by this as a definition is just financial. But let me give you a definition. If peace is the absence of anxiety, prosperity is the longing for stability. The longing for stability, which goes way beyond money. It's relational or relationship stability. You can see, again, some of these things on the right side that really impact one way or the other. But it's the longing for a family stability, for security in a whole lot of fronts, fears in Runn that can disrupt that stability. Just basic needs cause people to be and feel unstable. If basic needs aren't being met for shelter, for food, a variety of things, even the desire to be known individually. Do people know me for who I am? That can disrupt stability. That desire even to be able to express responsibility, to take ownership of something. Jake talked about how we have an opportunity to co-create with God, that we were, as image bearers, we get that chance to create too. A lot of people don't experience that. It affects, it disrupts that desire, that deep desire for stability. So it's way beyond money. Sometimes we can, especially in a Western mindset, equate prosperity only with financial wealth. That's not what this is talking about necessarily. That's just one small aspect of it. But it's this longing for stability in life, where everything feels unglued, is coming unglued. But that's a circle that's a little more intimate. It's a pathway, but it may not be the first place we go. It may present itself, and absolutely, if the Lord allows, and that's the pathway that He gives us, then we converse over that. But we might start with peace and then move to prosperity, and then finally, purpose and that deep desire for meaning. Probably the most intimate aspect, the most intimate longing. Why am I here? Do I matter? What's my purpose in life? Those are all questions that relate to that core longing. And we ask the same questions. Again, we want stability in our lives. We want to know that we matter. We want to know that there's meaning in our lives, that we exist for a reason, and that we can make a difference somehow, some way. Those are questions of purpose, but they're much more closely held and much more intimate. And again, sometimes, at least, again, Tom referenced our crew training, but at times I think of our crew training in the past, we kind of jumped to issues of purpose. And sometimes it was fine, but again, in today's world, as we're watching how many are on the scale of belief, way down on the end of unaware, that may not be our best entry point. And so again, evangelism, gospel engagement may end up being more of a process and a journey as we journey together with people, and purpose may not be the first place we go. It may be talking about issues of peace or issues of prosperity, and then issues of purpose. It's probably not that linear either. It's probably just all low in between. But the point is that these core longings, again, provide those points of authentic connection because we have the same core longings. But they're also pathways to conversation. These are entry points where, again, not just for us to present, but first to fill in the framework of a persona and hear a person's story. Because when I talked to Danielle, what I heard was a deep longing for both the absence of anxiety and stability. Really what she presented primarily to me was the issue of stability. How am I going to make this work? With a child at home, and me having to have a full-time job, and there's not enough money. It had anxiety in it, but it was really an expression of stability. And she was willing to talk because she was also somewhat of an explorer at that point. You see how these things begin to come together? So I think they can be deeply practical as we think about if moments and conversations are how ministry is done in the wild field. And again, don't only think of us as a professional class of gospel ministers, but think about those in our congregations and those we have the opportunity to influence. How do we get them engaged into the mission? What we're suggesting is from the research, these could be some ways in which we help them to reach out to their relational network, those 100 to 150 people that God's divinely placed around them, that they see all the time, on a broad continuum that they see regularly. These are ways that they can begin to engage. They begin to enter the mission. No longer sitting back in fear, but able to take the initiative. We often say that probably biblically, as far as we can tell, there's probably two things we can never take away from the task of evangelism. Biblically, we can't take away the offense of the gospel itself. Scripture tells us it is offensive, mainly because we want to be our own gods, right? And so to say that you can't be your own God and you're desperately in need of another one, is offensive to some. We can't change that message. But the second thing I don't think we can change is our need to take the initiative, to move towards people. Again, back to Charmaine's quote from the video, that we're the ones that should be uncomfortable because we're moving towards people. I think that is part of our missionary calling for every follower of Jesus. We will move towards you. But we can move in a very humble, listening posture, thinking about these core longings that we actually share, that become again those points of authentic connection, pathways to conversation. We have the ability, I think, in some very tangible ways, and to move towards people and equip our people to do the same. Because again, they may be the ones far more than us that have relationships with this end of the spectrum of the personas, and certainly be unaware of the scale of belief. Let me stop just for a minute and see if there's any questions related to this. I'm going to bring up Tara and Cheryl in just a minute, and we'll move towards lunch. But any questions on the core longings, or maybe some comments? Again, this can be shared learning. It's not that I'm the answer man, but maybe you've had some experiences, even like I did with my Madeline's Danielle, that also kind of highlight some of these things. Yeah?
So, some of my own personal interests of like, okay, I want to, I was coming out of college, like I need to read all these apologetics books to be equipped to argue with people into the faith. And more recently, I've been reading a lot more about people like Charles Taylor saying apologetics have been the death of Christianity, and that it's like we're giving in to these arguments and playing by the, on the terms of the Enlightenment, whereas, people have these deeper longings. I'm curious, in your research, have you seen like a place and a role for apologetics, or in relation to just talking about these longings, or what?
Yeah, John, good question. Just say, what's the role of apologetics today? Because that has played a role in the past, and where does that fit today? Is that a good summation? Yeah. I can give you my opinion. I don't know if the research itself suggested much, but one of the things I'm beginning to see, and actually this began for me in my journey of living in Europe and then coming back to the U.S., and it highlights what I mentioned yesterday, that I don't think people so much today are asking, does Jesus exist, or did he exist, but does he matter? If you hear that question, that's a move away from evidential apologetics. There's different kinds of apologetics. We have to be careful not to just put everything in one category. So there's evidential apologetics, which we're kind of known for, that is a reasonable approach to the validity of Scripture or the existence of God, or some of those kind of questions. To more of a cultural apologetic, and again, the value of story. Does Jesus matter? How's he making a difference in your life today? You sharing your story about how Jesus matters actually is still an apologetic. It's just not an evidential one in the sense that we traditionally talk about. I still think there's a role for evidential apologetics. One of the things I didn't mention yesterday, and this kind of piqued my interest again when we were still living in Italy a few years ago, the final thing, I mentioned 3 things that Italians told us. The 4th thing they told us is that every one of them had a question that was deeply personal to them, that in their mind had to be answered before they could come to faith. Again, this is just from a human perspective. And those questions were all over the map. For one girl, I remember it was, why did my best friend die last year? And she was 21. And so it's not still so much an evidential apologetic. And actually, how do you answer that? That why question is never easy to answer. What she really wanted was just somebody to listen and engage with her. It was really about relationship. But on some occasions, back to your question, there was a couple of questions like, how can I really believe this? You talk about this book. The priest gave me one long time ago, and I haven't looked at it, and I'm not sure I trust the church, the institutional church of Italy. So how am I supposed to put my confidence in this book? Well, that was back to an evidential apologetic. Well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the validity of Scripture. So I absolutely think there's still a role for evidential apologetics. I don't think it plays the role today that it used to, in my opinion. Blake, were you commenting on that? Or?
Well, yeah, I think it's really important to look at the scale of belief, to use some of this language. Evidence matters, but it doesn't matter until somebody's very curious.
That's a good point.
Right? So if you're dealing with a content person or an unaware person, evidence isn't going to do a thing. And so just
that's
know
a great
where
point.
you are.
John, Blake. Yeah, Blake said, obviously can still play a role, but it doesn't matter to the person who's at least not curious. If they're still unaware and comfortable or content, those things aren't going to matter until they're probably at least curious. No?
Yeah, to kind of corroborate what we have up here, 40 years ago, Francis Schaeffer said, what drove people was the search for personal peace and happiness. 40 years ago. Things have changed.
Yeah, well, if you heard him, he's talking about Francis Schaeffer quoting that personal peace and affluence was a great driver. Yeah, you see in those core longings the same tenets, don't you? Again, I think the prosperity is actually beyond just affluence. Again, how we tend to think of it as mainly financial. I think it is much broader and much more about stability overall. But it includes that. It at least includes enough to get by. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, other things you picked up? Okay, well, we can keep these conversations going or questions over lunch, so please feel free. You guys thought everybody engaged so well yesterday. Take advantage of that at the end of the day. But I'll bring up Tara and Cheryl, and they'll take us towards that.
Thanks, everybody. How's everybody doing? Everybody ready for lunch?